You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is Monday, the 19th of May. It's a surprisingly busy time right now in IU athletics. A lot going on. And we're going to have not just IU athletics going on, but we've got Pacers, we've got Indy 500. It's just a whole lot of stuff going on in central Indiana right now. And we're going to talk IU today. A lot of stuff going on in the recruiting world. And we've got Zach Browning from On3 and the Hoosier joining us. Zach, good to see you. How you doing?
I'm good, Galen. I'm doing well. Summer, nice to be home, nice to relax a little bit. How are you?
Fine. Also feeling the same, enjoying the warmer temperatures. I could do without the EF2 tornadoes in town, but everything else has been fine so far, you know. But should be an interesting conversation. We're going to talk recruiting. Zach's been burning it up on the website and on X, getting information out to the peoples. We greatly appreciate that. We want to talk about some of that because I know it's certainly of interest to many of you. Before we do that, real quick, just a reminder, we're brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, and, of course, Indy 500 apparel, Pacers apparel, Fever apparel, as well as IU and any other college you might think to buy apparel from. Use the code HOME23, get 15% off of your first order. And you may have to actually go certain places to get Homefield apparel. You can order the Indy 500 collection they dropped on the site, or you can go to the gift shops at the Speedway. There's an exclusive to the Gamebridge Team Store t-shirt that's pretty cool. It's Boomer in an Indy car, kind of celebrating the dual heritages of May in Indianapolis. So head to those places. You can't use the code there. You can try. You should. If you go to the Gamebridge Team Store, tell them Crimson Cast sent you and you want 15% off, and let me know what their response is. I'm quite fascinated. But anyway, Homefield Apparel, our presenting sponsor here on the Back Home Network. We certainly appreciate them. Also, a reminder, subscribe to us on YouTube. Just search Back Home Network on YouTube and join us there as you get to watch this interview as opposed to just listening to it. All right, Zach, let's dive right in. We were talking before the show, and I was like, we could do football, we could do basketball. We're going to do a little bit of both. I want to start with football because it's the sport that I think more people are like really excited by right now. And Indiana has definitely made some moves in this recruiting cycle that I would argue kind of highlight a very different recruiting, not just philosophy, but a different mix of players that they are suddenly in line for and are starting to get commitments from. Why don't we start with what stuck out to you over the course of this last month or so as we've started to see some of these verbal commitments coming in from pretty highly regarded football players, both in state and out of state?
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head right there. Obviously, Curt Cignetti, the success that Indiana had last season, we assumed it would translate eventually to the recruiting side as well. And we've kind of seen that already take shape throughout the first offseason, the first real offseason Curt Cignetti's had at the helm of the Hoosiers. And what stands out to me, Galen, is that the guys that he's brought in, the handful of guys he's gotten verbal commits from Indiana's 2026 class stands at 9 guys currently. It's not just the run-of-the-mill Indiana 3-star after 3-star after 3-star. These are talented guys. On3 has a handful of these recruits ranked in the top 100 or in the top 150, the top 300, etc. Indiana has the number 1 ranked recruit in the state of Indiana coming to play next year, which is not something that the Hoosiers can say, not something that Tom Allen could really say during his tenure and stuff like that. But I think it's the quality of the players. We know that Curt Cignetti can do more with less, but now he's going to have an opportunity to do more with more. I think that'll be the exciting thing. He's got not only the quantity of players coming in this recruiting class, but he's got the talent as well. If you look at the recruiting classes between Indiana and Michigan just right now slightly ahead of Indiana. I think they're ranked 9th in the Big Ten per On3. Indiana ranked 10th in the conference for 2026. But they both have the same number of 4-star recruits right now. Indiana has 2 and Michigan has 2, which is not something that we've been able to say in years past.
Yeah, I mean, a lot there to dissect. I mean, let's start with maybe the most recent recruit that they picked up, Gabe Hill, defensive lineman out of Naperville, Illinois, has a high school teammate who's joining the roster this year. But this is a highly sought after guy. He's a top 300 recruit in pretty much every service. I think On3 has him at 249 in the country. This is not the type of recruit Indiana normally gets. I mean, we've seen them pull 4-stars on very rare occasions, but they're generally offensive players at skill positions, which are probably the hardest guys to rate. When you get to linemen, when you get on either side of the ball, or players like that, it means something to land a 4-star like that, especially when you're going up against the Wisconsins and the Illinois and the teams that Indiana really hasn't recruited well against historically.
Yeah, not just in the case of Hill, not just Iowa, Wisconsin, LSU was involved, Texas A&M, Notre Dame, who's an in-state and even closer to Naperville up there in Chicago. But again, going back to what you said at the beginning of that, there is an IU recruit in the class of 2025 that's from Naperville, Jacob Bell, a quarterback who was originally committed to Ball State, flipped to Indiana. And I think what stands out is that's not the only case of Indiana kind of developing recruiting networks, I guess I would call that. Indiana, there's a number of instances where Indiana's reached out to a handful of guys from the same high school as some of the guys on the current roster. Indiana's kind of developing the networks, and Chicago, Naperville, in that kind of area is a very important kind of place to be able to recruit, especially if you're Indiana. You can't just recruit in-state in Indiana. You got to go reach into Chicago, got to reach into Ohio. We've seen Indiana do both of those things. But what stands out to me about Hill, and he said it himself, he said, they're a team with a lot of ambition, a lot of things to prove, so it's exciting. He said he loves Curt Cignetti, and I think when you're talking to any recruit, whether it's football in the class of 2026, whether it's the class of 2027, anybody you talk to on the recruiting trail about Indiana, Curt Cignetti always comes up. Yes, the relationships with the kind of more on-the-site recruiters, the likes of Mike Shanahan and like that, their names get brought up. Yes, the connection between them is important, between them and the recruit. But not just that, you have to be able to recruit as the head coach. And I think that we're seeing kind of the pull that Curt Cignetti has as a recruiter. I mean, you can see the quote right there. He's got the pull. He's kind of got, for lack of a better way to put it, he's got the aura, Galen, that some of these recruits like to follow.
He's got Riz. He's got recruiting Riz, Zach.
There you go.
But it's interesting too, like going into the same well that you've gone to for past recruits, even if they're just one cycle previous. It's almost like using influencers in your recruiting process. It kind of worked with Fernando Mendoza in a different way, since they already had Alberto Mendoza on the roster, and certainly that helped to grease the wheels a little bit to make that happen. But you make some interesting statements here, and I think it's worth noting. Cignetti. Whatever you think of the bravado that Cignetti carries himself with when he's talking to the press about his team or when he's talking to fans, some people like it. Some people are like, this is a bit much, but it really does seem to carry well with high school football players and transfers because he's a confident guy. He has a clear plan. And I think sometimes we underestimate how much those two things resonate with players and parents, when oftentimes they're dealing with coaches that don't want to commit, that they or don't have, for whatever you want to say about like Tom Allen, who was clearly a very passionate guy, could really communicate that passion pretty well, but was kind of short on details, and it kind of showed up in the types of players he brought in and the way that the developmental cycle worked thus far. And certainly going back to what you saw Cignetti do with the way he recruited at James Madison, there's a real clear through line that he can point to with not just him, but also his assistants about, hey, we've said we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and here's the proof in the past of what we've done that can take you to that level that you want to get to.
You're exactly right. And I think we're kind of seeing the power that building a strong coaching staff around a guy like Cignetti has. I mean, these are $1 million assistant coaches. That's not something Indiana has ever been able to claim on the football side of things. You look at Mike Shanahan, that's $1 million assistant right there. You look at Brian Haynes, he's making more than Mike Shanahan at this point. So these are guys that have been paid and compensated, not only because of what they can do X's and O's wise in the middle of a game, in the middle of a season, but also what they can do on a recruiting trail, and not just identifying talent, but actually landing that talent. And I think that's another big important thing as well. Indiana is competing not only in state with the likes of Purdue, with the likes of Notre Dame, who's a big-time school, but regionally with Ohio State. Indiana, one of the second-ranked recruit right now in Indiana's 2026 class, Henry Olinger, is an athlete from Columbus, right out of Ohio State's backyard. So Indiana being able to go into those places, that's not necessarily strictly the state of Indiana. I mentioned Casimir Hicks, defensive back, the number 1 ranked recruit in the state of Indiana. He's already coming to Indiana, but not just the in-state guys, because it's a little bit different on the football side and basketball side. Yes, you need to be able to recruit in-state for football, but you also have to be able to spread out, especially if you're Indiana in the Midwest. And we've kind of seen that. We also have seen Curt Cignetti with that kind of Pennsylvania, that Pittsburgh background. He's reached into those regions a little bit as well, but you got to be able to recruit not just the state of Indiana, but the Midwest as a whole. And we're seeing that not only with Curt Cignetti, but Mike Shanahan, Brian Haynes. I mean, you mentioned the plan. There's a reason Indiana's strength and conditioning coordinator was so highly sought after, and why he got a raise to stay in Bloomington, because that's part of the plan. You come here to IU, maybe you're 6'2", 275 pounds. You come here, you spend a summer here, and all of a sudden you're 15 pounds of muscle heavier. I mean, that's the kind of plan that Curt Cignetti has for his players, and that's what, as you said, resonates not only with the players but with the families as well, which is an underrated part of the high school recruiting.
You know, the recruiting Indiana and the Midwest thing is really interesting, because this was not something that Allen's staff did. They were very focused on what they knew, which was Florida and a little bit of Georgia. And you know, you look at the heat map of where a lot of those recruits came from. That was where they were coming from. And they had some successes. I mean, clearly you get a Michael Penix out of Florida. You know, there's some other players that came out of that realm. It's not that it's bad. It's just that you know, there's a certain level of competition you have to engage in if you're going to recruit in the Midwest. And one of the things I think people misunderstand about the state of Indiana is there's actually a good amount of football talent in the state, but it has historically gone elsewhere. It has not gone to IU. Ohio State, Michigan, Notre Dame, you know, Alabama comes in, takes a guy, and then that level of 3 stars that you could normally build off of as developmental pieces, well, they've been going to Iowa. They've been going to Michigan State. They've been going to Wisconsin. And it's interesting, you know, when Curt Cignetti got hired, one of the things I remember us talking about was, well, they really do need to go right at the Midwest and see if they can make some inroads. Now, going 11-1 in the regular season and making the college football playoff helps a ton. But it's also the fact they've restocked talent-wise. Like, they look like a team that's going to be here to stay. You know, they're ranked in some polls at this point. And, you know, you're not going to win every battle. But if you can win a decent amount of the battles in state, if you can go get, you know, not just, like you said, Casimir Hicks, but they got Trevor Gibbs from Crown Point, who I think was the number 3 player or number 4 player in the state. You know, they've got a couple of other guys that they're kind of on the threshold, perhaps, of getting. They've got 3 or 4 guys that On3 is classified as like elite prospects in one form or another. I mean, that stuff really does stack up. And they're 8 or 9 commits deep into a class that's probably going to be about, you know, 22, 23, I'm guessing. And, you know, last year they were 53rd in recruiting, and that was not really a good representation of what Curt Cignetti was going to be able to do. This is really the first time we've seen them recruiting against the big boys with a full year under their belt. That's all really exciting, I think, if you're an IU fan.
You're exactly right. On3 currently has Indiana ranked 31st in the country, 10th in the Big Ten for the 2026 class. And you bring up the fact that Indiana has multiple top 10 ranked recruits in the state of Indiana in this class of 2026. That hasn't happened since 2022. That's the last time Indiana had 2 top 10 ranked recruits from the state of Indiana. They go elsewhere, as you mentioned, Notre Dame, Ohio State, Michigan, those types of places. Indiana has 3 this year. The last top 10 recruit period that Indiana got from in-state was Tyler Cherry. And, you know, his injury struggles are what they are. But Indiana could walk away from this 2026 class, Galen, realistically with 4 probably top 10 ranked recruits, not only just in the state of Indiana alone, which is eye-opening for Indiana, because you have to be able to win your state. Once you can win your state, then you can kind of go out, like we talked about with a guy like Henry Olinger, go out to Columbus, get him, Gabe Hill in Naperville. I mean, it starts with winning your state. That's obviously the foundation, but then you can kind of branch out from there. And I think the thing that Indiana has going for it, they've got that foundation of this class. There's 2 4-stars in it right now, 7 3-stars according to On3. The talent is still there. The talent is still out there. There's still plenty of uncommitted 4-stars. There's still plenty of top guys. I mean, if you look recently, Indiana in the Final 5 for another 4-star recruit, another 4-star defensive lineman, and Cameron McHaney. He's got Indiana in his top 5. His official commitment date is set for a couple of weeks in the future. So not yet, but that's one to keep an eye on for Indiana. Another 4-star that would put here. I'll explain it this way. If Indiana were to land both Hill and McKinney, I was doing some research earlier, those would be the 3rd and 4th highest ranked defensive line recruits ever since Indiana football and recruiting websites have started to kind of track that stuff. You've got Dasan McCullough and you've got Darius Latham back in 2013. So,
and
I mean, you've already got
one of those guys got a big asterisk by their name since it was a family connection that I think you could say brought them here at least as much as anything else. And obviously Darius Latham was a great addition and was a stalwart on that line. But yeah, no, it is fascinating. And I think, for a lot of IU fans who are still trying to process how to feel about last year and how to feel about where IU football is at, this was always the class where I was like, okay, this is going to tell us if this is real and if this is resonating. And, it's in football recruiting, so much of it's about networking, so much of it's about, what coaches as who your coaching staff knows. Taylor's talked about this a bunch on our podcast. Like, what camps are you going to? Who are you talking to? Where are you in the mix? And this is a really well-respected coaching staff, as we've seen. You mentioned not just strength and conditioning nearly getting hired elsewhere, but Brian Haynes was potentially going to go get hired elsewhere. He got a raise. It's clearly a staff that the big boys have noticed, and they're going to be a force to be reckoned with as long as they're here. And I think it's going to be interesting watching them continue to try to lay this foundation down. And as you think about like where Indiana lands, we've, on this show, we've been saying for years, it may not be sustainable for IU to try to go after 4 stars and 5 stars because they've just historically done poorly with 4 stars and 5 stars. Like for every McCullough who played really well, it came in, you'd get, you go back and look at any of the classes from the last 5 years and anybody that was ranked above a 3, it's like maybe there was a reason that they slipped through the cracks of the upper echelon. Obviously, we'll take a wait and see approach with this current staff and what they're doing, but this feels different from a recruiting perspective. It feels a lot more stable, and it feels like there's a specific plan. And the fact they're recruiting so well on the defensive line, an area that's historically been a difficult spot for IU to compete against, especially with the Big Ten lines they deal with. It's just a lot of exciting things all at once.
And I think that's maybe the biggest thing, the defensive line, the offensive line, those two areas, because I asked Curt Cignetti after that Notre Dame game, after Indiana season was over, I asked him, what's the biggest difference? Your 2 losses this year, Ohio State, Notre Dame, what's the biggest difference between programs like that, teams like that, and your team right now with how it's constructed? And he said the depth was one thing. So obviously the recruiting class, having deeper recruiting classes helps with that. But he also said just the sheer size in the trenches, the defensive linemen, the offensive linemen. If you're a 4 or a 5-star defensive lineman or an offensive lineman that's a 4 or 5-star, you are that because you're 6'6" and like 330 pounds. Like that's just something you cannot teach. The 4 stars and the 5 stars, they get that ranking not only because of their production, but just because of their sheer unteachable size. So if Indiana is able to recruit more guys like Gabe Hill, he's a 4-star defensive lineman. He's got that unteachable size that you just can't do anything about. He's right now 6'2", 275. And that's before he gets on campus. He's still got another year of high school football to not only play, but to grow physically as well. So when you're looking at that, when you're looking at the offensive and defensive line, that's really where you got to get your money's worth. That's where you can get all the 3 stars you want. Of course, Iowa, Wisconsin, those types of schools have a history of turning the not as highly touted 4-star and 5-star guys into those behemoths that you see in the Big Ten. But Indiana, if you can recruit those guys, because there's the debate, stars don't necessarily matter, but they kind of do for that interior offensive line, that defensive line as well in the trenches, because those guys are just big.
Well, and look, I think it's Ari Wasserman has done a lot of really good work at where I forget who is Ari at On3 now. Like,
yeah, he's with us. He's on.
I've lost track of who's with who at this point, but he's done a lot of really fascinating studies into who exactly gets to contend for national titles every year. Now, it's a little bit off now because we're in a 12-team playoff era, probably soon to be a 16-team playoff era as opposed to 4 or 2. But it's very clear that stars matter if you want to compete for titles, if you want to compete for playoff spots. And one of the things to keep in mind about Wisconsin and Iowa, like they've had their moments, but they've largely been teams that have been in the 8 to 10 win range. They've been on the outside of that conversation looking in by and large. IU's got grander ambitions than that right now. And I think, once you taste the college football playoff, and now especially given that the pathway is not quite as difficult to get there as it used to be because there's more spots available and because you're in the Big Ten, you've got to recruit at that level. And it's just jarring in a good way to think that IU has a sales pitch that's working and has a group of people who seem to be able to deliver not just the sales pitch, but can back it up with actual demonstrated, history about what they can do at pretty much every position on the roster.
And especially when you look at the Big Ten, the addition of the West Coast schools doesn't necessarily impact Indiana that much because there's kind of different regions. I mean, the West Coast schools aren't necessarily dipping into the Midwest all too often. I mean, you look at the top 5 classes in the conference right now. USC is 1, Oregon is 3, Washington is 5, UCLA is ranked 7. So the West Coast schools have come in. They've kind of dominated the recruiting front out west. They've kind of taken over where was the Pac-12, and they've kind of dominated out there. But that doesn't necessarily affect Indiana. Again, I go back to what I was saying earlier. Indiana's class is currently ranked 10th in the 2026 class. Michigan is 9. Iowa is 8. Indiana's ranked ahead of Illinois, ahead of Wisconsin, ahead of Michigan State. And this is before Indiana really kind of picks up even more steam. I mean, there's still plenty of guys that are left, not only in state, but in the surrounding areas as well. So Indiana very, very far from being done in this class. But you look at it right there. I mean, this is no longer a team that we've seen. If you scroll down, Galen, Indiana's been right next to Purdue for the last handful of years, and they are not with Curt Cignetti.
Well, and it's interesting because like the delta between where Indiana's at 10th and where Penn State's at in 4th is not that great. I mean, you're talking about a couple of points. Penn State's got a lot more 4-stars, and that's what's propping them up. But Washington and Maryland are basically only where they're at because they each have a single 5-star. And who knows if those guys are even going to sign with those teams. I mean, we've seen some late-breaking changes in some of these things. And so it's going to be interesting. This is a steady progression for IU. And the nice thing for IU football, we can kind of close on this for the football part of this, is that used to be that the recruiting rankings were basically the end-all be-all of where you were going to be as a program in 3 years because that was going to be your talent pool. Now with the transfer portal, you can add whatever you need on top of it. You can't disregard football recruiting. Like you have to have good recruiting classes. That's where all of your development comes in. But if Indiana is somewhere between 6th and 10th in the Big Ten recruiting rankings regularly, and then can add high-producing players out of the transfer portal who want to come and play in Curt Cignetti's system, that's really the formula. Like, I don't think Indiana, it's like, why is USC ranked number 1 in the recruiting rankings for this, for the Big Ten? I mean, it's because they're USC. Same reason why Ohio State's where they're at. The idea that IU is going to punch through and get to that echelon seems fanciful, but that doesn't mean they can't compete with those teams. Because, I mean, USC regularly recruits very well and is not a team that really had a lot to show for that on the field. And I think that's an important thing to remember.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, Indiana right now 10th. You have to go back to 2022. Again, that's that Dasan McCullough, Travell Mullen, Omar Cooper, Nick James kind of class where the last time Indiana had a top 10 ranked recruiting class. And that's where this will be kind of the determining factor. This will kind of be the season because obviously those 2022 kids, they committed after that 2020 season, which was pretty special for Indiana. 2021 didn't go so well for IU. And then you saw the kind of fall off in recruiting back down to the regular levels in 2023. So this will be a year. The recruiting, the momentum can only go as far as you win games on the football field. So if Curt Cignetti is able to win and consistently win and keep that going and maybe not make the playoffs but continue to be that caliber of football team, then the recruiting momentum will surely follow.
A lot to be excited about. And obviously we'll see if anything else pops in this cycle of the recruiting. Now, just a quick dates reminder for everybody. We're in a commit period here right now for football. What should we expect calendar-wise as we move through summer and into fall?
Right now, as you mentioned, kind of the commit cycle, there's also Indiana's doing, and a lot of teams around the country are kind of focusing a little bit on the 2027 class right now, kind of sending out those offers, maybe the 2028 class as well, but kind of sending out those offers, doing some scouting, checking out some of those younger high school guys Then as you get further along into the summer, it kind of flips back. It's visit season, it's camp season. Those 2026 guys will get on campus. It's primetime summer. They're done with their high school seasons, or not even seasons, but they're done with their high school years as far as schooling is concerned. So they'll be able to get on campus again. And then you kind of see kind of another wave of high school commits after once their school year is done. And then after that point, it's kind of one of those situations where there will be a handful of guys left. Again, the camps, the visits, those kind of are big things that you have to look at. So look at more 2026 guys kind of scheduling visits, getting on campus. A lot of those guys already have visits scheduled. A lot of them are kind of waiting for a visit here or two, where Indiana football have a lot of guys in June, July come and visit. And then you've got 2027 that'll kind of take shape. That'll get kind of pushed towards the rear view mirror, kind of the back seat come June. So June, July, keep an eye out on those months for kind of the 2026 class, because you've got all those camps, whether it's a big man camp, offensive line, whatnot, and stuff like that. Guys will be getting down to campus June, July. Those are the hot months once that 2026 class kind of ramps back up.
Let's switch gears and talk basketball. As you know, Darian DeVries got hired, and then it felt like we were in a waiting game, and there were jokes about, are they going to have enough people to put on the roster, or, you know, what's going to happen? Then they fill the roster over about a 3.5 week period with a ton of transfers. Then everything kind of slows down. Then the coaching staff finally gets announced, and, you know, we find out you got Kenny Johnson coming in. You pull in a new assistant coach who, you know, was a recruiter at Tennessee. You've got Drew Adams who comes in, and then all of a sudden the offers start flying. And man, it's been hard to keep track, Zach, as we're not only getting offers, we're starting to get visits scheduled. What stuck out to you on the basketball front in terms of both like where the commits are coming from and what types of players Darian DeVries and his staff seem to be trying to go after?
Well, Galen, I think it's really clear that positional versatility, the kind of ability to play multiple different positions, do multiple different things on a basketball court, is really the headliner for Darian DeVries and his staff. You look at the transfer portal commitments, there is plenty of positional versatility there. I mean, there's not a guy taller than 6'8". I know that's been talked about at great length, whether that's a good idea or not, but that's a conversation for another day. But you've got plenty of versatility. You've got guards that are 6'6". You've got guards that are 6'3". You've got wings that can handle the ball. You've got plenty of guys that can shoot. And that's just the transfer portal class alone. You look at the kind of high school guys that Indiana's kind of begun to offer and trying to schedule visits. It's, again, more positional versatility. There's guys that are guards, but they can shoot. They can play off the ball. There's forwards that are 6'8", 6'9". They can drive. They can space the floor a little bit. You know, it's all about positional versatility. That's kind of been the name of the game. When we've seen that with the guys that Indiana brought in, not only in the transfer portal, but also the guys that Indiana's watched this past weekend in the first live period in session 2 for both EYBL and Adidas 3SSB. Versatility, that's the name of the game. Versatility, shooting as well. You guys, Indiana wants shooters as well. That's kind of been a common theme. But positional versatility, shooting, not only in the transfer portal, but also in the recruiting class. That's been the name of the game so far for Darian DeVries and the staff.
Let's kind of break down a little bit what each of these assistant coaches is bringing to the table right now. Let's start with Drew Adams. We heard from Drew Adams. If anybody watched that, the Players Perspective podcast that Hoosiers Connected, Sidney Parrish interviewed Coach Adams last week, I think it was. And, you know, obviously Drew Adams, not a new name to people around Bloomington. If you've been around long enough, he's been at Cincinnati here recently. I mean, overall thoughts on what he's bringing to the table in terms of his recruiting, like, umbrella, I guess, and what you would expect to see in terms of the types of recruits that he's going after.
Yeah, I mean, Drew Adams, his kind of recruiting specification, his expertise, I guess you could call it, is Indiana Elite. It's the state of Indiana. He was a coach. He worked with Indiana Elite. He's really close with that Indiana Elite program. And let's just say, Galen, that is not a bad program to be close with. That there's plenty of highly touted guys that come out of that program year in and year out. Plenty of highly talented guys in the 2026 and 2027 classes that put on phenomenal shows this past weekend. Indiana, Drew Adams specifically, but Darian DeVries, Rod Clark, Kenny Johnson, those types of guys, they were watching those Indiana Elite teams. They were in Iowa on the 3SSB circuit. So Drew Adams, Darian DeVries, they got a good look at those guys. Some of those guys like Jason Gardner Jr. from Fishers, Cooper Zachary from Fishers, Anthony Thompson, who's one of the top-ranked players in the 2026 class. He plays for Indiana Elite too. And what's curious about Indiana Elite, it's not just Indiana guys. It's kind of Midwest guys. I mean, you mentioned Anthony Thompson. He's from Western Reserve, Ohio. I mean, that's not a guy from Indiana, but again, that Indiana elite connection, the state of Indiana as a whole, even Cincinnati a little bit. We saw that Drew Adams almost got Flory Badunga to commit to Cincinnati before ultimately committed to Kansas. So those connections, plentiful for Drew Adams, not only just in the state of Indiana, more specifically, though, with Indiana Elite, which is a fantastic AAU program.
You also, of course, a new name in the mix, Rod Clark, the former Tennessee assistant. This is kind of a different type of coach than what we've seen Indiana hire in past cycles, but certainly brings a lot to the table as well. Where is Rod Clark's kind of locus of control from a recruiting perspective?
It's interesting. He doesn't necessarily have an expertise. Now, obviously, he came over from Tennessee. Right. So he came over from Tennessee. So he's got plenty of connections with kind of the Tennessee area, but he's much more of a national guy. He's simply put just a great recruiter. I was talking to one of the Tennessee Rivals guys after Rod Clark got hired. I was like, hey, give me the rundown of what Rod Clark brings to the table from a recruiting standpoint. And the word he just kept on repeating was elite. He's just an elite recruiter. Almost got Nate Ahmet, who's one of the top guys in the 2025 class, to commit to Tennessee. And he's got plenty of guys, whether it's Dalton Connect, who helped get via the transfer portal, Kennedy Chandler. I mean, these are guys that were developing, and Rod Clark helped get them to where they were, to Tennessee. And so I think that's the biggest thing. Rod Clark, he's got kind of, again, you go back to Curt Cignetti, he's got the aura, he's got the riz. People in the recruiting game, people around the country, not just in the Midwest, not just in Tennessee, not just around Indiana, but as far to the West Coast, to the East Coast as well. They know who Rod Clark is. He's got a reputation for being an elite recruiter now. It's not necessarily just in one place now. If we do look at somebody who Indiana offered earlier today, Trey Thompson, he's from Tennessee. And Rod Clark, I know, is leading the way kind of on that recruiting front. That's a new offer for Indiana. But Rod Clark's kind of leading the way there because he is from Tennessee. He's known Thompson for around a year and a half now since he was recruiting him to Tennessee. But not necessarily any regional expertise, kind of just an all-around dog. I would describe Rod Clark as. He's an elite recruiter. He does it around the country. People clamor for Indiana to land those kind of 5 stars, those top 10 recruits. That's Rod Clark. That's what he does.
And then we've got Kenny Johnson, who, if you've been around IU basketball at all, you're very familiar. Kenny Johnson brings the DMV with him. And this is where I think the immediate impact of any of these hires, like it feels like it was the most pronounced, as there were a ton of DMV-related offers and now a couple of visits that we've seen come out of this. And, you know, this is a coach that we're familiar with. We've seen what he can do already with IU recruiting in this area, and it looks like he's picked right back up where he left off, and then some, frankly.
Yeah, and Kenny Johnson, he should likely excel in the NIL era. I know the last time he was in Bloomington, there was some things that he wasn't necessarily allowed to do in the recruiting front, but, I mean, he can go out, shell out the money, kind of do that kind of stuff now. And you mentioned it, the DMV area, and it's not only that, he kind of has that kind of northeast area a little bit further north than just the DMV because he was at Georgetown, so he's kind of reached into the New York, New Jersey, that kind of area as well. But Kenny Johnson, again, very well respected. He's as much of an expert on the DMV as a guy like Drew Adams is with Indiana Elite and those types of programs. And the DMV, I mean, you think about Victor Oladipo, you think about those types of guys. In the 2026 class, there's a handful of guys from the DMV from that Maryland area. And so it'll be interesting to see because you've kind of got 2 kind of new entrances to that DMV area. Obviously, you've got Kenny Johnson, who's now with Indiana. He is one of the top recruiters in that area. Now Buzz Williams with Maryland, he's going to have to try and battle it out. So it'll be interesting to see. Indiana obviously has some recent recruiting battles with Maryland, Derek Queen, but we'll see if Kenny Johnson can kind of help out in that situation because, as you mentioned, he's got the DMV, and he's kind of been active. He was the guy that I believe actually offered Trey Thompson. If we're talking about recent recruits, he was the guy on a phone call that actually offered Trey Thompson. So it's not to say we talk about Drew Adams with Indiana Elite, you talk about Rod Clark nationally and Kenny Johnson in the DMV. They're strictly held into those areas. They're going to spread out and do more than just that one specific area. But if there is an area of expertise, obviously, with Kenny Johnson, it's there.
Well, and the 3 players we've seen so far that have scheduled visits for June of this year, I think they've got Kenny Johnson fingerprints on them. You got Latrell Ullman, who's the highest rated of the 3 players that are visiting. I think is 40th or 41st in this upcoming class, and he's from Richmond, which is, of course, that's the V part of the DMV. You've got Sammy Jackson coming in, and then you've also got Prince Alexander Moody, who we've heard. And again, as you say, kind of positional versatility. All those guys are between 6'4" and 6'8". You'll probably see some other ones pop up here as well. Are you surprised that we've seen this much action this quickly? I mean, you kind of have to do this in this era, but it does feel like we went from no news to a ton of things happening all at once with basketball recruiting.
I mean, that's kind of how it works just with the calendar of the high school basketball recruiting. Obviously, this was the first live period session this past weekend. So really the first time that Darian DeVries, the coaching staff, has been able to go out and kind of see guys in person. Obviously, there were some guys that when you bring in a completely new staff, you've got guys from all around the country, Kenny John, all those types of guys, they're going to kind of bring some offers with them. You kind of see that with some guys like a Latrell Allman, like a Sammy Jackson, Prince Alexander Moody. Those are kind of guys that Kenny Johnson had been recruiting and now is continuing to recruit elsewhere. Rod Clark's the same way with a guy like Trey Thompson. So you've kind of seen that carryover. And so, no, it's not necessarily surprising. It's just Indiana. It's weird. They're kind of playing with a different type of hand because they haven't been on the ground. They haven't been kind of doing this. I mean, Darian DeVries hasn't been recruiting any of these guys to Indiana. I mean, he had that 2025 class at West Virginia. Those guys are all now gone. But now he's got to shift gears completely and try and figure out a class in 2026 for Indiana. But we've seen Indiana be aggressive. We've obviously talked about the positional versatility, I think, being aggressive. And I think what Darian DeVries has done is he's shown how active he can be on the recruiting trail and how active he's willing to be. Obviously, that was one of Mike Woodson's things that he didn't necessarily please Indiana basketball fans with, was maybe how inactive sometimes he was on the recruiting trail. I know here at the Hoosier.com, we talked to Trey Thompson earlier, the kid that got the Indiana offer this morning. He said that Darian DeVries actually texted him over the weekend. They watched him play on the Adidas 3 SSB circuit, and then he got that text from Darian DeVries. I believe his exact quote was somewhere along the lines of, if the head coach is texting you, you've done something right, or that's pretty special, something like that. So I think the ability and the willingness to show that he can go above and beyond. I mean, even in the transfer portal, you go back to Lamar Wilkerson. Right. Wilkerson said that he flew on the plane Darian DeVries did to go meet with him. So he's shown that he's –
might have been in the room while he was Zooming with Field of 68. It's possible, right? Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, Darian DeVries has shown his willingness to go that extra mile, go extra far and beyond. And I think that will stand out when you look at some of these kids, because like we talked about with the football side, you're not just recruiting the kid, you're recruiting kind of the high school coach, the AAU coach, and the parents as well.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a big difference. And we talked about this, well, many of us talked about it over the last couple of years. Like you can't leave recruiting to your assistants. And you really need active assistants as well as having an active head coach. Like it's not an either or. And you mentioned like Indiana is playing catch up with this class because, for a lot of these guys, there's been in-depth conversations and interactions and, attempts at getting guys to commit for a couple of years now. I mean, who was it? Tony Bryant is a good example of that. Like he was offered by Tennessee, by Rod Clark while he was at Tennessee. And then now Indiana's jumping in. That'll be a tough one to make up ground on just because of how coveted he is as a recruit. But those are the kinds of things where you're almost going to need a 2-year cycle with basketball, much like we saw with football, where you had to go through a full season to really start to make inroads on the recruiting trail with the guys that you want. And you got to paper it over a little bit with portal, or you got to find a couple of guys who are willing to take a crack on you because you've got more playing time. And that's one of the things I think it's going to be really fascinating with this class for Indiana basketball is they purposefully went after a lot of veteran portal guys that have only got 1 year. They don't have a ton necessarily like left in the tank for the following season. You may get a guy here or there who decides to stick around for whatever reason. You're obviously going to have more portal signings, but that's going to have to be attractive to some of these top-rated players in this next class because there's going to be a lot of playing time and you're going to be playing in the Big Ten at a team that people are going to be paying attention to.
Yeah, I think that was something that Latrell Allman specifically noted when I talked to him after he got that offer and then eventually scheduled that Indiana visit. He said there's just so much opportunity to go to Indiana and be a household name. And I think despite kind of the lack of recent success for Indiana, there's still just kind of something about Indiana. These kids, they grew up, they know about it. They know what you can become at Indiana, the type of folk hero you can become if you come to Indiana and you produce. in that type of way. And it is interesting because this is almost, you mentioned that we mentioned Indiana's kind of playing behind in this recruiting class. It's almost kind of like a transfer portal type of recruitment strategy for Indiana. It's kind of a short, expedited process. Indiana has to go quickly. You typically think of the high school recruitments, and that's years over years. But this is just 1 year. Indiana really only has a couple of months before a lot of these guys decide to commit, probably prior to the start of their high school basketball season. And it's also interesting because when you look at the transfer portal class, there's, the Tucker DeVries, the Reed Bailey, there's some top tier elite transfer portal pickups. But Indiana kind of went a lot with that kind of under the radar guy, the guy that maybe necessarily isn't the 4 or 5 star transfer, isn't a top 100 transfer, but fits into that Darian DeVries system. But you've kind of seen that not shift, but be different on the recruiting front as far as the high schoolers are concerned, because Indiana is shooting for the stars. There's pretty much every guy that Indiana's offered. There's a couple of guys outside the top 100, but most of them are 4 or 5 star guys. Most of them are even top 50 guys, some even in the top 10 in their respective recruiting classes. So Indiana not necessarily waiting to go with those lower end guys. You kind of the Purdue strategy where you get those 2, 3 stars and you kind of build out the roster like that. Indiana, Darian DeVries, they're kind of shooting for those upper echelon guys, but they're upper echelon guys that still fit that mold of positional versatility of shooting. So we'll see if DeVries and how many of these guys he can actually land.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. And look, this is in this era, basketball works so much differently than football in terms of the way that you accrue talent and who you can put on the floor. There's a lot less long-tailed development in most cases with guys. And I think you see this, like Dusty May took a year at Michigan, and it wasn't like he blew the doors off the joint with the recruiting class for 2025. I mean, they've got a pair of 4 stars and I think an unrated recruit, and then they've got a bunch of guys that are transfers. They're really good transfers, though, maybe the best transfer class in the whole portal. But you can cobble things together across both. And I think what we've talked about, one of the big debates in IU basketball circles was, well, do you even need to worry about recruiting? Clearly you do. I don't think it's something you can just say, well, we're just going to go in the portal and that's it. But IU's in this unique spot right now where they have a couple of they have 3 like really good recruiters, like among the best recruiters, in college basketball. They're going to be doing a lot of work on that front. And as we've talked about on this show before, it's not necessarily about who you get to commit and come as a freshman. It's about what relationships can you build with the guys. So if they go somewhere and it's not actually what they thought it was going to be, or you suddenly have a spot open for them to be a starter when they're a sophomore or a junior and they want to transfer, well, now you've got that relationship that you've built up as opposed to having to start it from scratch.
How many times have we seen a guy that was recruited by a team in high school, went somewhere else, and then ends up there at the transfer portal? It happens so much. You definitely, in this day and age of recruiting, you cannot burn any bridges as a head coach or as an assistant coach. You have to be able to keep and maintain those connections. I think that's also a big part of it. Gone are the days of 5, 6 plus player recruiting classes from the high school ranks. You're not looking to, Indiana's cast a decently wide net. There's around 10 to 15 offers that have gone out in the last month for Indiana in the 2026 class alone. You're not looking to land all of those guys. There's no need to bat 1,000. If you get 2 or 3 of those guys, I'd say you're pretty happy with that type of recruiting class.
The only schools in the Big Ten that signed more than 3 players in their recruiting class for 2025 are Washington, Penn State, Rutgers, Northwestern. And I think I guess Illinois is in there too. Other than Illinois, I think you could look at all of those teams and say those are teams that are in trouble right now in the Big Ten in terms of trying to figure out where they fit and how they're going to land people. And they're also, I think all 4 of those teams are teams that don't have much of an NIL budget. So they have to go to the high school ranks, whereas Indiana has the benefit right now of having money to play with in the NIL portal while also having money to play with when it comes to straight up recruiting.
Of course, you throw Illinois in there, but half of those commits, 2 of those 4 are international guys, so they kind of do it a little bit differently. Brad Underwood likes to reach into that international kind of pool, but you bring up Dusty May. If you look at Indiana's class, again, just like in football, it's right behind Dusty May's for the 2025 class. Trent Sisley is a fantastic player. He'll be great for Indiana. Maybe not in year 1, but eventually throughout his Indiana career. And you look at it, even the top teams, Purdue doesn't have a great ranked 2025 class. They have the 14th ranked class in the Big Ten for 2025. But again, it's not necessarily about the stars. That's where kind of basketball and football are different, because you can get a 3-star guy that's 6'8" and 220 pounds and is an athletic guy, but you can't necessarily get that 3-star that's going to be a behemoth on the offensive line in football. So the stars, they don't matter as much for basketball, I would say, as they do in football. Of course, you still want that top-end talent. We saw what Duke did this past season with kind of that freshman class of those top-end guys. But there's multiple ways to do it in basketball. We've already seen Darian DeVries has had the ability, not just here at IU, but with West Virginia too, to kind of build his teams through the transfer portal. But it'll be interesting to see how he balances both moving forward, and kind of what an ideal high school recruiting class quantity-wise looks like for him moving forward.
Zach Browning, great stuff. Really appreciate you sharing your insights. And if you want to catch Zach, he's got his Twitter feed up, or his X feed up in the video here. But if you are listening instead of watching, it's at Zach with an H, Browning 17. You can catch his work at the Hoosier on On3. I highly recommend it. And Zach, enjoy the rest of the summer. Hopefully we'll talk again as we get some more recruits committing or whatnot. It should be a wild ride for both football and basketball this summer.
Absolutely, Galen. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks to all you folks for tuning in. This is Crimson Cast. Once again, we'll be back with a lot more podcast coverage later on this week. So be sure to stay tuned, subscribe on the YouTube channel. Hit us up on Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com. Our thanks to our presenting sponsor, Home Field Apparel. We will catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. Bring back the bison. Hope you checked out the new video today. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody. I think I said catch you on the flip side like 3 times. I apologize to the YouTube audience for that.